I was noticing that in A Wedding Song for Poor People, a lot of the characters are artists in some way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're musicians, they're painters like Roger, they do theater. And I was just wondering, what's the role of art in your fiction? What kind of, what are you trying to communicate about artists by focusing on them so much in your work?
I think it's probably wish fulfillment.
Okay.
Yeah, I always wanted to be one.
But you are.
Well, not, so I get to write about it. I get to imagine it, you know.
And, but a lot of the people who are artists in your book are really kind of tortured as well. Like they're either musicians who have given up their instrument, or they're painters, but they're mainly just kind of like living and traveling with somebody really rich.
Yeah.
Is that something you observe a lot that happens to
No,
artists?
that was actually a story called In This Economy. And you know that fantasy that some of us have that if only I had a patron, if only somebody would give me a lot of money and I could just do my art and I wouldn't have to worry about, Now, and then you think about what actually it would take to have that happen. And so that's where that story came about. So the painter stops painting and they're traveling all over, and it's this completely empty and vapid life.
Because he doesn't have to focus on his art at all.
Yeah, there's no tension. So there's no creativity, or there's no reason, or I don't know what it is with him. It's a strange passivity that he has in that story.
Mm-hmm. And he kind of focuses more on entertaining people and being attractive than actually painting, which is, yeah.
Because painting's hard work.
Yeah, right.
It's easier, I think, maybe it's also hard work to be attractive and entertain people if they're really rich. I don't know.
That's true. Yeah. And you see it sort of happening a lot in other fields like today as well. But yeah. And, another thing that was very curious was economic class, like that. For people who read the book, one of my favorite stories was the We'll Meet Again, and it's basically about a wealthy, very well established woman who's at her father's funeral, and she's there and she's looking at the guests and she's judging them. She's especially furious at her husband's second wife, Ruby, who comes from a much more like, wasn't she talking about how her mother is a stripper and other things like that? So she just can't stand the sight of her father's second wife. And there's a lot of people, like Roger is in a clearly economically disadvantaged position compared to Henry. And I was just wondering how, what kind of, not statements, but what you wanted to say about economy, not just in A Wedding Song for Poor People, but also in your other works. It comes up a lot.
I guess it's always made me curious what the relationship is between people with money and people without money. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to say that in Wedding Song for Poorer People, no one is actually poor as in really, everybody has enough to eat, everybody's got a roof over their head. But it's sort of gradations and degrees. And as I was observing the world and living in the world in the 1980s, I was more and more horrified by the inflated numbers, or the inflated, I've forgotten the word, income, right, because I hardly have any. So it's like an income, right, that's it, income. And trying to be paid for things you don't actually do, have income streams, and get other people to do your work for you, which, to an old Marxist is kind of a bad idea. And that everybody falling in love with that more in the 80s and 90s, and that nobody seemed to be questioning it anymore. So I just got curious about what is the relationship between people and money, and people without money and people with money. And Roger's relationship to money is that he gets paid and then he spends it on, his mortgage and on heating oil and supplies, and he makes a certain amount of money, but he's not paying attention. Whereas Henry is really paying attention, and so he has a ton of money. And he's actually generous with his money. He supports artists. He's a patron. But it's like a different world. It's that old argument between Hemingway and Fitzgerald, where the rich different or not. And I can't remember who said what. I think Hemingway said they really weren't different, and Fitzgerald said they really were, and who knows if they're right. But
yeah, but in another way, I mean, some of the wealthier characters are kind of impoverished in other ways in the book. That Henry is really starved for love. He can't, seem to find it, and
yet he has found it.
Jason?
He's actually, I think he's in a relationship. It's not perfect, but he's in it. Whereas Roger's always kind of bewildered by the whole idea of being connected and in relationship. He's baffled by it. His primary relationship is painting.
And what about, can he or any other artist have a relationship that doesn't overshadow the art that they're working on?
That's a big question.
Or
I
does
don't know.
art have to be their
This is where we ask the audience. Well, it was a big question in the 60s and 70s around women artists.
Oh, yeah.
And it still is a question.
Right.
And it's like, I remember when my friend Margot had her first child, and she really, what did that mean for her as an artist in terms of her work? And then what was it about being a mother that took creative energy that she was glad to give? But how did she make sure she wasn't bitter about not getting into the studio and doing her art? And she actually would make art around that piece, that relationship, her shifting relationship to the art that she made.
Would you say the society kind of views it as it's one or the other? You can't prioritize both?
Yeah, in a way. And yet there's a certain tension in trying to do both. I mean, I know people who were raised by working artists. Both parents were working artists, and they did it. Actually, they were mostly craftspeople. Now that I think of it, they weren't fine artists. They actually made things that people could use, and so they could sell them. So that may have made a difference in terms of the economy of it. But
yeah, and I guess you could say the same about business people too. Or do they let their work overshadow everything else? And getting back to the relationship between, Henry and Jason, which you said, he's in a relationship. It might look like a, completely, Jason is just using Henry for money kind of thing. But the way you write it, or the way you perceive it, this is like a real relationship for him.
Sure, I think it's a real relationship for Jason too.
And does the fact that Roger get in there and become like the third guy in the relationship, does that is that meant to be like a harmonious kind of like triangle there?
Nah.
No. Okay.
Nah. No, Roger is threatened because this shifts his relationship to his friend and patron, and that's really all he's interested in. And he also can't stand Jason because he's a young performance artist. And it's the young performance artists that are kind of kicking the painters out of departments and overshadowing, and nobody paints anymore. And, it's this other thing that's happening. And so Roger's feeling like a cultural dinosaur. He's like, well, at one point Jason says, oh, you still paint with brushes, and Henry's, Roger's sitting there going, well, yeah, it's like, what do you... Oh, I used to paint, says Jason. He was 25 or something. I used to paint, but I gave it up because it was too inactive and I needed movement and it was too, something like that. And Roger's just about to wring his neck.
And so he would get along very well with somebody who views Barbie dolls and putting them together as art.
Right.